Good morning from a chilly Johannesburg. I'm Terence Corrigan, Projects and Publications Manager at the Institute of Race Relations, and welcome to today's webinar where we will be discussing mining, specifically the IRR's proposed alternative mining legislation. This is a matter of profound importance to the country, and joining me today is Dr. Anthea Jeffery, Head of Policy Research at the Institute, prolific writer, author, commentator, and legal scholar who has been giving this, I would say, not only months of thought, but decades of thought and observation, and is here to present some ideas on how we can turn what used to be described as the great garden of minerals in the world back into that sort of mineral garden of Eden. Now, before we, to frame the conversation, let me just read something that Dr. Jeffery penned in a recent letter to the president. The mining industry remains vital to South Africa's economy. In 2025, according to the Minerals Council South Africa, the sector contributed 5.8% to GDP, added 810 billion to export earnings, employed 470,000 people, supported the jobs of 400,000 more, and provided all these direct and indirect employees with some 680 billion in household income. The industry also paid 100 billion to the fiscus, while a further 240 billion in tax contributions came from its supplier base. However, the industry could contribute even more and sustain its contributions far further into the future if the damaging laws holding it back were reformed. This, of course, is what we are here to discuss this morning. The mining industry, as I say, long the kind of great treasure, South Africa was long the great minerals treasure trove in the 1980s. The US Congress described it as the Persian Gulf of minerals. Well, we've fallen into some heavy weather. Sorry, I just want to pull up a number here. In 2006, South Africa spent something like 6.3 billion rand was spent in mining exploration. In 2025, that's last year, this had tumbled to 0.7 billion. We've seen the number of mining companies listed on the JSE halve. We've seen tens of thousands of jobs lost. And I think most concerningly, we've seen a tumble in the value of our minerals exports. This should not be happening for a country with South Africa's competitive advantage. So, to understand what's gone wrong and what can be done right, I'd like to kick the conversation off. Anthea, give us some background. What has gone wrong with mining in South Africa?
In South Africa, yes, that was a very big question. In South Africa, it very much is to do with bad policy, and particularly with the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, or the MPRDA, which was enacted in 2002 and brought into force in 2004. And what it did was really to shake up the industry in a very negative way. First of all, whereas 2/3 of the mineral resources, the minerals beneath the ground, had previously been in private ownership and were valuable assets, estimated with a value of 100 billion rand. These were all now placed in the custodianship of the state, without any compensation being paid. That was endorsed by the Constitutional Court in an extremely weak judgment, and it must have made mining investors around the world concerned that there could be what amounted to an expropriation without compensation. In other words, a nationalization. And that, incidentally, is how President Ramaphosa described the law just recently when he said that we had nationalized our mining assets. So, first big blow. The second big blow was now that mining rights, which companies already had, were no longer to be valid under the new legislation. They had to apply for so-called new order rights. And the criteria for gaining those new water rights were vastly vague. In other words, one of the things you had to do was develop and then comply with a suitable social and labor plan. But the Act gave no clarity as to what a social and labor plan should contain. So mining companies did their best to interpret this, but the bureaucrats adjudicating on their applications had massive discretion to say, well, either they'd done well enough or they hadn't. So that kind of discretionary power opens the door to corruption, because it becomes possible to favor some and disfavor others, not for objective reasons, but for some nefarious reason. And the other thing that it did was to introduce Black economic empowerment effectively in mining. It was cast slightly differently. There was talk of needing to provide redress for historically disadvantaged South Africans. So white women, for example, were given some capacity to share in these deals. But in essence, it was just BEE by another name. And we had attached to the MPRDA a mining charter, which came into effect at the same time as the Act. And it required all mining houses seeking to apply for mining rights or seeking to convert their existing mining rights to attain 26% BEE ownership, let's call it, by 2014, within 10 years. And if they didn't, the conversion of their old mining rights would not be approved, and applicants for new mining rights would not succeed either. So this was now something that the mining industry had to do. It was promised that 26% figure was immutable, that it wouldn't be raised higher, and it was also told that a continuing consequences principle would apply, so that even if BEE investors subsequently sold out, they wouldn't have to do new deals in order to keep that BEE ownership at 26%. Because if they did have to do repeat deals, it would be absolutely crippling. We've been talking about Elon Musk not wanting to come in with Starlink because he would have to effectively give 30% to a BEE investor, not of his choosing. Well, for a new mining company coming here, they have to give 26% of their equity to a BEE investor, not of their choosing. That in itself is a big hurdle. And the last thing you want is to think that number could go up. And yet that's what the government is trying to do, pushing it up to 30% in the 2018 mining charter, which was subsequently struck down by a high court, indicating back in 2002 what they really wanted was 51% for new mining rights. So a scary situation for many mining companies with a great deal of uncertainty about the rules and how much they might change in the future, the existing rules being damaging, the possible future rules being crippling. So that's the first thing that we did. But we enacted the wrong kind of law, very different from what Botswana has done. And then we kept on making it worse, mostly through new iterations to the mining charter, where the mining minister, ignoring the fact that he has no legislative power and actually no capacity under the MPRDA to come with a new mining charter, has purported to do precisely that, always pushing up the BEE targets to something even more unrealistic and costly. And then in addition, if one just looks across the whole spectrum of the South African economy, we've done many other things which make it difficult to mine too. The fact that Eskom power was so unreliable for so many years, the fact that the costs have gone up so sharply, and that very high cost factor remains in place. And that our infrastructure has also really been crumbling, particularly in the last 10 years or so that getting your mining product to port by rail and then getting it through the ports is increasingly a problem too. And then there's crime. So a whole number of factors do play in, but one of the most important is mining law. And so it's important that we get mining law right. That's the first criterion. Wouldn't be enough. You have to look at the other things as well. But getting mining laws right is essential. Otherwise, the investment will not come in, particularly into the new mines, which, as you were saying, are the lifeblood of the industry. Unless money comes in to explore and to create new mines, then it truly is a sunset industry with a limited shelf life.
Right, and I think that the last point bears emphasis that right now we are kind of, in a sense, consuming our capital. We using up those operations that have been going sometimes for decades, without the new, and let me say, the innovated operations coming online. Remember, a couple of years ago, I did a project about this, and a gentleman at the Minerals Council said that what South Africa future mining is likely to look like is smaller scale, modular, the kind of approach that's been pioneered in Australia. Many of the large mineral deposits simply don't lend themselves to the type of large fixed operations that we have now. But that requires a particular faith if you're going to innovate your way into that. Now, South Africa clearly has its problems, but across our northern border, there's an example of a country that is also quite well endowed with minerals, particularly diamonds. They seem to show a different path and a more productive path. And I'm talking, of course, about Botswana. You've written about this at length, and I'd like to ask you, okay, what has Botswana done that South Africa has not done? Or what have they done different?
They've made their mining law clear and certain. So that's one of the key things that we want to include in our mining bill. In Botswana, when you apply for mining rights, in essence, what you need to show is that you have the financial and the technical capacity to conduct the mining operations which are approved, to maintain mine health and safety, to remediate environmental damage. And those are the criteria. So it's not whether you've complied with a vague social and labor plan. It's not whether you've managed to meet an ever-escalating BEE target. Those are the tests. And the upshot is that on the most recent Fraser Institute report, Botswana has done extremely well on that particular aspect of its mining environment. And just to explain, the Fraser Institute, which is a civil society organization in Canada, has for many years been compiling an annual survey of mining companies. And in the most recent one in 2025, Botswana did extraordinarily well on the two key measures. They have a sort of overall index of investment attractiveness, which looks both at policy issues and at the mineral endowment of a particular jurisdiction. And then they look solely at the policy issues, because those, of course, are within the power of the relevant government to change. The government can choose to have good laws or it can choose to have bad laws. And in Botswana, they have chosen to have good laws. And on this particular one, whether their existing regulation is certain and well administered and so on, you see on this latest report that 90% of investors have a positive view of this aspect of Botswana's mining law. And only 10% have any reservations or would see it as a deal breaker that would make them turn away. In South Africa, the figures are exactly the reverse. There are 10% who have a positive view of our regimen for mining rights applications, and the 90% who regard it as a complete deterrent or a deal breaker. So we need to be in Botswana's corner, not in the one we are now. We need to reverse it so that we can be close to Botswana and the positive rankings that we gain on the Fraser Institute.
Right.
And then so that's that's where Botswana really outshines us. And they have, fortunately for them, also managed to deal with issues like crime and infrastructure much more strongly and effectively too than we have.
Right. Now, I think that segues into the reason we're here. Mining legislation. I note with some satisfaction that critics of government policy are often asked, well, where's your constructive solution? Well, here it is. The growth and employment in mining bill. We have literally written the law. Anthea, would you like to take us through what does this say? What are we proposing? What would we like to change?
Right. Well, that's a big topic, so we should look at it in bite-sized bits. And so what we did was to identify the main problems in our mining law when we've talked about the application process, that it's too uncertain. and lends itself to corruption. But we also looked at the circumstances in which mining rights can be cancelled, because this is a very scary thing, of course, for a mining company. They have to invest, especially if it's going to be deep level mining, huge amounts of money, especially if it's a new mine, and then after years they can begin to reap profit. So it's very important that the mining rights that they thought were going to last for 30 years should. So if the mining rights can be cancelled on rather arbitrary grounds, that's also a big deterrent. And in fact, we have broad criteria, again, in the MPRDA, saying, any breach of the Act, but a breach of the Act could include things like not having an adequate social and labour plan, whatever that might be. So again, it's the uncertainty of the law that makes for uncertainty about cancellation. And we've had ministers also threatening mining companies with the loss of their mining rights, for example, not complying adequately with BEE rules, even though they've changed the BEE rules in the interim, and the company has complied with the original ones, the only ones the mining minister is entitled to develop. Or they've said, for example, there was an instance in the state capture period that if certain mining rights were not transferred to the Guptas, then the mining rights would be cancelled. So it's very bad if politicians have too much discretion over your mine. So we've said we need something very different in the GEM bill. And what we've said is that cancellation would apply only for fraud, for willful and material breaches of this Act, which is much better constructed than the MPRDA, and that if there is a cancellation which is unwarranted, then this amounts to an expropriation, an indirect expropriation, for which compensation is paid, which would be effectively market-based plus compensation for all direct losses. So there's a deterrent against bureaucrats arbitrarily deciding to cancel without good reason. Then we also looked at another of the main problems, which is completely unrealistic beneficiation requirements. Now, South Africa has actually beneficiated minerals for a number of years. It's gone back decades. It's not the sort of main business of a mining company to beneficiate. Most mining companies will do a certain amount of processing, but beneficiation into final products is really a different kind of operation. But if it makes sense to smelt chrome ore, for example, then this has been done. Unfortunately, we're now finding it increasingly impossible to do it because Eskom prices have now made it so very costly to carry out such an operation. And meantime, China is busy flooding the market with much cheaper product, which we can't compete with. So we need to recognize reality. So whereas the new proposed government bill, which would replace the MPRDA and which was put out for comment last year, would make beneficiation compulsory. And it would say that mining companies must make an unspecified percentage of their minerals or mineral products available for beneficiation. But that's entirely unclear. How much and on what sort of terms? Make available could be you have to give it, or it could be you can sell it at market value or something less. It's entirely uncertain. So what we want to do in our bill, rather, is to say there's no obligation to beneficiate. But obviously, mining companies will do that if it makes economic sense. And there should be no penalties if they calculate the odds and think it's not their core business and it won't be economical to do it.
Right. Now, look, I think that's critical. This sort of conflation of taking things out of the ground and turning them into final products. It just displays a ruinous degree of illiteracy as to the way in which businesses work. Being a good doctor doesn't make one a good lawyer anymore. And by analogy, being a good miner and being able to get minerals out of the depths of the earth surely can't be easily translated into turning iron ore into iron sheeting, particularly at a competitive price. But that seems to be an almost ideological obsession. The idea that South Africa needs to not only reindustrialize, but reindustrialize with a particular set of essentially counter-economic considerations overshadowing it. That brings me, of course, to the to I think what is the kernel of this empowerment policy, the great tax on arrival. What should be done differently, and how do we propose doing it differently?
So, as I said, we would not make the granting of mining rights dependent on meeting BEE requirements in any way. We would take away all the BEE requirements, and we would replace BEE with what we call economic empowerment for the disadvantaged. And that differs really in three core ways. First of all, it's non-racial, which complies, of course, with the founding value of our Constitution. And where it seeks to advance people, it will select the people to be targeted on the basis of their income, not on the basis of their race. So the government tends to assume that we misused race as a proxy for disadvantage, and we argue that we should look directly at disadvantage, that this is by far the most important thing, because we now know from some 30 years of experience that when you use the racial criteria, this enables a small Black elite to garner most of the benefit of the BEE initiatives. And I think this is particularly evident in mining, just to elaborate on that for a moment, because very recently we've been able to obtain access to a document that was compiled for the Chamber of Mines, as it was then in 2015, which was really an assessment of whether the Chamber had succeeded in meeting that 26% goal by 2014. So they looked at all the deals that had been done and estimated that a value of somewhere between 150 billion and 230 billion, something like that, had been transferred to BEE beneficiaries. And who were they? They said at least 46 BEE entrepreneurs, who they estimated had got between 2 billion and 3.7 billion each, which was 310,000 times more than the small amounts that had flowed to 6.9 million community members, and about 25,000 times more than what had gone to 200,000 mine employees. So it was clear who really got the benefit. It was a small group of probably politically connected people close to the ANC. And the great majority of Black South Africans gained nothing from these deals. What they did find was that mining, one of our core industries, was no longer attractive to outside investors, that jobs were shrinking, and that there was less opportunity in mining than there had been before. And this is a story that has played out in other sectors of the economy too, so that the poorest are bearing the brunt of these policies. They're the ones who find there's no investment, there's no growth, and so there are fewer and fewer jobs. And every year, more people come into the housing market, and there are no jobs for them to do, with the result that we have now on the expanded definition, looking at people too discouraged even to keep looking for jobs. 12 million people unemployed. So they don't benefit. What can we do that will benefit? And we then come to the second two aspects of EED. The first, that it really rewards growth. There's what it does, it says to mining companies, there'll be a new EED scorecard, and your contributions will be measured in terms of, first of all, economic ones. How much are you contributing in terms of your investment, in terms of the exports that you're able to contribute to, in terms of the taxes that you pay, the innovation that you fund, and so on. So there are a whole number of economic criteria. These are the things that mining companies will be keeping track of in any event. But at the moment, they get no recognition for the fact that they are actually contributing to the economy. They are helping to make that flywheel go round and round. And then there'd be a labor component in terms of which they would also be recognized for what they're doing in terms of employing people, for the salaries they pay, for the PAYE that goes into the fiscus on those salaries, for the training that they provide, for other employee benefits that they provide, and so on. And then there'd be an environmental aspect of it too, because that is obviously very important in mining. And so there would also be recognition for what mining companies contribute by way of environmental remediation, making sure that they're mining responsibly, which is a very important thing to do, And that again would be recognized, but the rules would be reasonable, not unreasonable, and I'll come back to that later. And then finally, in terms of communities, there would again be recognition for the kinds of contributions that mines make to communities, often at the moment in terms of trying to improve water supply. So mines, for example, are trying to purify their wastewater to the point that it can be used by communities. That kind of thing is in their interest to do, and it serves communities well. But here too, I'd like to turn to the third aspect of EED, because this is where it really reaches down to the grassroots, to the poorest, and makes a difference to their lives. We know that year after year, we spend a lot of money on publicly funded schooling and also on housing and healthcare. About 650 billion, I think it was last year in the previous financial budget. And what do we get for that? 80% of schools are dysfunctional. About 80% of public clinics are dysfunctional. They don't meet the most basic standards in terms of even on things like hygiene. And housing, we supposedly provided millions of houses, but our housing waiting list is now bigger than it was when we began in 1994. So we're not doing it very well. And this makes me think of something that the World Bank said in the 1960s, that for many years the idea was that if you just looked at the supply side, put enough resources in the state, then it would be able to supply what was needed in these spheres. But obviously they also recognized that often it was badly done, it was inefficient, it was often quite corrupt. People weren't happy with what they were being supplied. They said, maybe we need to start looking at the demand side. And of course, if people are poor, then they can't afford very much, but we can increase demand by diverting some of the tax revenues that the government has been using badly into vouchers for the poor. And the vouchers can then be made available to poor families so that they can choose what school they want, what kind of healthcare they would want, whether they would rather go to a private clinic than a public one. And this has been tried in various countries, and it's been found to have a very positive impact. In India, for example, there's now 450,000 private independent schools providing schooling to 92 million people. I suppose still small compared to the overall size of the population, but it shows that this is not just a sort of meager thing. It's quite substantive, and people are keen on it. Families know that their children can get free public schooling, but they also know that the teachers don't really teach, and that the results are poor, and the discipline is poor, and they come out often still illiterate and innumerate. So they're willing to dig into their pockets and pay for low-cost private schools for 92 million Indian children, because the results are much better in terms of the standards attained, in terms of the values and the discipline instilled. So I think in our country, with our extraordinary high levels of unemployment, we can't really expect the poor to be able to fund even very low-cost independent schooling. But it's an important thing that should be available to them. So if you take that money that's being so badly spent by bureaucrats on public schooling, and you divided it up among low-income families and said, now you have a choice. You have a voucher. That voucher follows your child to whatever school you choose. So the school has got to start competing for your voucher. If it's a public school, it can't just depend on, well, next year it'll get the same amount in the budget and probably more. Now it's got to start attracting you as a customer to the school. And independent schools will know that there's not a much bigger demand because people have vouchers, and so many more independent schools will spring up too. And so you get a situation where the public is no longer just a monopoly, but has to now compete with private, and everybody starts doing better, holding down costs and quality.
No, sure.
But if we shift to EED, then this is a real benefit to the poor, and it means that mining companies, as part of the EED charter, could say top up the vouchers of children in mine communities, and this would be a constructive thing to do in a very different environment where schooling is now being put on a basis where it can function well.
Just let me make a small observation there. I did some work last year on CSI spending. That interestingly was was a contribution that South African businesses sort of gave to the world, starting back in the 19th century. Now, an official from the Minerals Council said to me, the problem is we can't boil the ocean. Just as mines are not in the business of beneficiating minerals, they're also not in the business of running bakeries or opening creches. But this is a sort of responsibility that's now been placed on them. Now, he said in practice, what tends to happen is that mines have to negotiate their social plans with municipalities. There's a great deal of gatekeeping. Technically you're speaking to the community, but invariably you are speaking to somebody that the local municipality has placed in front of you. And he said, what this frequently means is that mines find themselves having to underwrite prestige projects that the local municipality has identified, and this ends up creating a great deal of trouble, because this can also mean that their CSI spend is diverted into politically favored communities, and often these are not the ones who are most directly impacted by a mining operation. Remember that mining tends to be a rural activity. Some of those rural municipalities are extremely large, so a mining operation may impact, let's say, 10% of the community. The other 90% never see it, but the political incentives can be to make sure that all that CSI spend goes to part of that other 90%. So right. Something that I think could bypass some of the local gatekeepers, and obviously we have our challenges with municipal governance. I think could really start to become a game changer, and I think could also direct some of those resources to where, let's say, mining companies would have the greatest, or communities that would have the greatest moral claim on those mining resources. As I say, those are those in close proximity or who are supplying the labor. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think just perhaps two comments in response. Exactly, and it also reminds me of a World Bank statement that you can't have good policies in you can't get good projects rather in a bad policy environment.
Sure.
You can do your best on a project, but if the entire policy environment is negative, it really is just fiddling at the edges. It makes no real difference. So you need to change the overall system, and this is what the voucher idea is intended to do. As I said, to break the government monopoly, to promote competition, to have public schools doing better, private schools doing better. And in terms of the overall EED scorecard, mining companies, if they don't have to do this, it wouldn't be compulsory, but if they did, indicate on the economic side what they're contributing, on the environmental side what they're contributing, on the labor side what they're contributing, most of their contributions would, of course, be made there because that's all core to their business. To the extent that they also contribute to communities, they would have a real choice about of which children, for example, they might want to top up, or where they might help fund a health clinic, which is going to be run privately and which will be better for the people and the environment than the public one. That doesn't very often make sense. So it's a way of changing the whole dynamic. That is no longer just projects in a bad policy environment, but a little bit of help in a good policy environment.
Right. I would like to invite everyone following us. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat function. And while all our friends out there are thinking of clarifications and challenges, Anthea, closing mines down. This is obviously something that South Africa has had to struggle with. We've had well over a century of mining, and I think before one starts pointing fingers, I think it's important to note that the environmental consequences of a mine's post-operation life were not well understood back in the 1800s. We've got a much better understanding of it now. The system we have at the moment was billed as being green and clean and ensuring sustainability for future generations. To my observation, we haven't really achieved that. So, what's gone wrong, and what should we and what could we do better, and how could we do it better?
Mm-hmm. Let me just mention one thing and then park it for a moment. The reality is that we have about 6,000 mines that have been closed in the past before our environmental knowledge and awareness of what to do increased. And so they're a legacy issue and they need to be resolved. So park that for a moment. That's the background, of course, to the government wanting to make sure that when mines are closed in the future, they are properly dealt with. And so the MPRDA, and what I think is a good provision, requires mining companies to obtain a closure certificate. So there must be adequate remediation. There must be some kind of expert confirmation that the remediation has been properly done, and then they get a closure certificate. What's being proposed now is that closure certificate will not be a final certificate, as it were. That even if you've done everything that is visibly needed, and you would, and the existing rules, get a closure certificate saying, okay, you've done it. You now, under the proposed rule that was put out last year, would also have to assume liability for latent impacts that might become apparent at any time in the future. So if some problem with the water crops up in 50 years' time, you're going to be held liable for that. But there, at that point, obviously, the causal chain from what you were doing and what has subsequently happened is very difficult to track. And it also means that the minister will say, well, you've made so much financial provision to cover environmental impacts. We are going to hold back whatever we think is enough to cover whatever latent impacts might come to light in 10 years, 20 years, 70 years, whatever it might be. So it becomes, again, costly for the mines. It becomes a further deterrent to mining here because it's in many ways an unwarranted liability. You may not have actually had anything to do with the latent impact that's become apparent. And there are better ways of doing it, which we're recommending too. And this really is an idea that comes from Australia, that you can set up a pooled remediation fund to which all mining companies contribute on an annual basis as a proportion of their overall remediation spending, both annual and overall what they envisage for closure. And then you build up a pool of funds, and that pool is available to deal with the latent impacts as they come up. And it's possible that pool could partially be used to try and address the 6,000 mines historically closed without remediation. But that really is a governmental responsibility, not a responsibility of today's mining companies. And of course, the government didn't waste so much money on all the things that we've been talking about, BEE premiums, a great deal of corruption in other spheres. Then we would be better placed to deal with those historical mines. And if we had the right kind of policies that attracted investment, pushed the growth rate up to 7% of GDP, saw our economy doubling in size every 10 years, then again, we would have the money to start tackling that kind of historical issue. So that's what we recommend. Let's do it sensibly for the mines that are still in operation and hope that the government will in time embrace the kinds of policies that enable us to grow and prosper and deal with the past.
Right. Okay, so we have some questions here. How receptive has the government department been when you engage them on these proposals? And has there been any change, improvement recently in the willingness to evolve policy and practices? And then somebody, I think, probably responding to this, we have an obstinate minister in this portfolio. He has no problem and he has no foresight, and that is a huge problem that I see. Anthea, how would you deal with these?
Well, I think one can't be Pollyanna-ish about the willingness of the ANC to embrace what we think is a good idea. We have written to the president, as Terence indicated, to explain the content of the bill very more comprehensively than I've been able to do today, and explain all the reasons for our concern about the mining industry and how this really could be a good solution. We promised that we would send a copy of the bill both to him and to Grady Montashe today. Now it's been released. We will continue, of course, through all our lobbying work to make the case for South Africa to follow Botswana's example. One of the practical differences between South Africa and Botswana is not very evident. If you look at GDP per capita in constant sort of inflation taken into account of purchasing parity terms, in 2025, GDP per capita in Botswana was, as I recall, my notes, don't want to get it wrong. It was $19,100 in these purchasing power. And what was South Africa's? $14,200. So tiny, landlocked Botswana, without any of our, they have mineral resources, but not our mineral wealth, which hasn't got the sort of industrialized, strong economy that we do have in this country. It's extraordinary that Botswana has so overtaken us in GDP per capita. And for every South African, that's really a telling gap. And it's a gap that we need to narrow. And we need increasingly for all South Africans to be putting pressure on the government to say, cease your ideological pursuit of what I call the National Democratic Revolution, your belief that socialism is going to be a good situation where the government controls or owns pretty much the entire economy. Look around, look at what works, and Botswana shows what works. So right there, we have an example of an African country that's prospered and done well, and we want to follow in its footsteps, which means we need to have sensible policies too.
If I can just add a comment there, when South Africa as a unit was formed back in 1910, that as part of that was the customs union, and the idea was that what's now Eswatini, Lesotho, and Botswana would effectively give up their customs management in order to allow the great locomotive to pull them forward. So they were going to be compensated for this. Really says something when when one of those cars is now outperforming the locomotive, and also as given what I've done in my life, we often used to talk about African solutions for African problems. It never ceases to amaze me that the most obvious one is the one that there seems an absolute determination to ignore. Moving along, if South Africa doesn't reform this legal framework in the next few years, what does the mining sector look like by, say, 2030?
I think, it's obviously hard to have that clear a crystal ball, but the risk is not that we just keep on with what we have in the MPRDA, which is, quite bad enough. The risk is that the Mineral Resources Development Bill, which came out last year, 2025, caused really, I think, a great deal of consternation among mining companies, which felt that their contributions on the policy just had not been taken into account at all. That has negative rules in so many ways, including on BEE, where the mining minister will truly be able just to keep ratcheting up the targets wherever he feels inclined to do so. That the ownership deals would no longer be protected by this ongoing consequences rule. So you'd have to keep on doing ownership deals whenever somebody sells out. That's a recipe for bankruptcy. So we have to hope that doesn't come, because that would really mean that our mining industry is in far more trouble far more quickly than they would be under the MPRDA itself.
Right.
But so long as we don't have the exploration funding coming in on sufficient scale, provided we have this trickle, we used to be attract 5% of global exploration spending, and now we're attracting less than 1%. It just means that we're kind of managing a slow decline, not really looking forward to expansion. And South Africa deserves better than that. So the other point to make is that the ANC support has really declined. The 40% outcome in the 2024 election, the fact that its support since then seems to have diminished further. There really is, I think, a possibility for pragmatic, moderate South Africans across the board who have become disillusioned with the ANC, with their hopes dashed as to what it would help achieve for the country. Need to make the right decision when it comes to the next election, and make sure that we go for parties and policies that will enable us to get the high growth we need.
Right. Next question. And once again, let me just extend a warm invitation to everybody. We have about 10 minutes left. Please submit any questions you might have. Have you worked with large mines, e.g. BHP, Rio Tinto, who have largely exited SA, to find out what it would take for them to re-enter, as well as which countries have improved policy making to make it more attractive? I assume some South American nations have improved or clarified their mining codes. Anthea, have we been speaking to those heading for the exit?
No, we haven't. But it is possible to look at some of the countries that have been trying to reform mining. Ghana, for example, has initiated various policies, and it's one of the countries in Africa that has recently developed a sort of independent regulator, with the idea that applications for mining rights, presumably on a more objective basis of the kind that we're proposing, would also be supposedly independently adjudicated by such an authority. There's an equivalent example in South America. I think it was Brazil has gone a similar route. So I thought about putting that in, but I worry about it so long as we have cadre deployment at such a level in South Africa. It's one thing to have independence on paper, but it must also translate into independence in reality. And one of the things, too, that's very important is that there should be an independent process of adjudication, which we haven't talked about, but other countries have also attempted to achieve, so that if there's a mining dispute, it goes to an independent tribunal. Here, it needs to go to the courts, and the courts have sometimes done well, as they did in striking down the 2018 mining charter, parts of it, and sometimes done very badly, as the Constitutional Court did in upholding custodianship. But overall, our courts are also sort of overburdened. So if you have a mining dispute, it needs urgently to be resolved. What they want you to do is to refer it to the minister or the sort of chief inspector of safety, some other official who will then decide on what his colleagues have done. So we're indicating in our bill we must have, as other countries have, an independent tribunal, but we should also have access to international arbitration, because that's what really matters the most. If there's the option of international independent arbitration, it means that mining companies can't be corralled within this country and forced to comply with a flawed adjudication process.
Look, I would just add that our experience with business, both domestic and foreign, is that there is a very, very strong aversion to expressing themselves on political issues, particularly where they work in sectors that are heavily regulated. So even if you are heading for the door over the Minerals Petroleum Development Resources Act, the prospects of being willing to say something and put your name on it are very, very slender. Because perhaps at some point, yes, maybe you would like to keep the door open, but there's a concern that there could be official vengeance meted out at you. We have not specifically with mining companies, but we have spoken to some firms that are offshoring themselves, and many of them will say privately, property rights, BEE requirements. Essentially all the great ideological holy cows have simply made South Africa uninvestable, a phrase that you, Anthea, I think just used this morning in your piece on the Daily Friend. In fact, I would encourage everyone to visit the dailyfriend.org.za. Anthea has an excellent op-ed about this. And unfortunately, I do think that business has rather let itself down by being so conflict averse. I can understand it, because once again, being a businessman and being a politician are very different, are very different provinces. But in an environment where so much of the business world is overshadowed by the hand of politics, at some point, I do think that companies do themselves a disservice by muting their criticism. Andrew Kenny, thanks for joining us, Andrew. I've got nothing to say. I agree with every word. Wonderful, fact-filled presentation and clear logical solutions. An artist is always pleased when his work is appreciated. And perhaps a more technical question, but for companies that already hold rights under the current system, would the GM bill apply retroactively or only for newer applications? What happens to investments and BE deals already structured under the old rules? Interesting question.
Yeah, interesting, and it's difficult to resolve. So, we say that under the GEM bill that all new applications, of course, would be on this basis. We also say that those who already have mining rights would be deemed to hold them under the GEM bill, and that they would have a new lease of life for 30 years, so they wouldn't suffer from switching to the GEM bill. In terms of unwinding existing BEE deals, that's obviously very difficult, particularly it's not only deals, it's procurement contracts too. The mines have come under huge pressure to also meet BEE requirements in their own purchases and the goods and services that they buy each year. And where you have an existing contract, practice of undersunt, you stick to agreements made. But on the other hand, if you're having a better new system, the process can be worked out, would have to be worked out. And I don't think I've adequately got my mind around that, but we're aware of the issue and we would give it more thought.
Look, my intuitive sense would be that particularly ownership arrangements would simply be recognized, would need to be recognized as they exist, irrespective of what process or under what sort of official duress may have brought them there. They are sort of a legitimate ownership structure, but as we say, I think this is very much a forward-looking proposal. What would it take to raise that expiration number, particularly from less than $1 billion to something that surpasses the 6-7 billion that we had 20 years ago? We are starting to approach the end, so I'm going to issue one last call for comments or questions. And in the meantime, let me ask you, Anthea. We are, as you said, we don't want to be Pollyannish about this. But let's say that we could get mining working again. We could reestablish South Africa's reputation as a safe haven for mining investment, as a profitable market. What does that do for the average South African?
I think it's good for everybody who's in mining and for the increased employment that could then develop with an expanding industry, rather than one that's either sort of stagnant or declining. But I think that what it would also indicate is that South Africa is open for business. It would reflect a new stance on the part of the government, a willingness to acknowledge economic reality. And I think if you were to get this kind of change in mining, where historically South Africa has been so very strong, where we have this enormous mineral treasure trove, where we know that there's now a huge demand for critical minerals, which are seen as important to the energy transition, this is a good time to look at mining and to make it work in mining and to leverage it from there into the wider economy. And we would need to do that, because part of what Botswana does so well on, particularly if people have a look at that article, are things that we fall down on, that are not law-related. It's not directly law-related. Crime and infrastructure. And those have obviously been heavily affected by our emphasis on BEE, because it's undermined the efficiency of government, and it's made it more difficult for either the police or ESCOM or anybody else to function in a cost-effective way. But if we start to change from BEE to EED in mining, then you can do it elsewhere as well. Then we rarely have the capacity to perhaps leave it open, prize open, policy barriers, obstacles in many other parts of the economy. And the more we do that, and the more we can also improve people's schooling in particular, and have a better system that I'm going to soon be writing on for technical skills at TVET colleges. It's terribly important that people should be empowered with skills as well. But it's putting our feet in the right path, and I think it would be a game changer. It would enable so much more.
Agreed. Okay, we are coming to the end, and with no obvious interventions from the floor, I'm going to draw things to a conclusion. I'm just going to say that about 15 years ago, I remember hearing one of the MMCs in Johannesburg at the time speaking in council, and talking about the glorious future that awaited South Africa, saying that we were going to take a leaf from Venezuela's book because they have revolutionized the country with oil, and we are going to do it with platinum. You know, as the sardonic South Africanism goes, "Kyk hoe lyk ons nou" in both places. Anthea, any final words?
No, I think we've covered all the key points, except perhaps one that I wanted to talk about, which is property rights, because the MPRDA is all about a disrespect for property rights, really, and they are essential. You know, there's a feeling perhaps that property rights only matter to those people who have property, but property rights are really the underpinning of economic freedom in the society as a whole, and everybody benefits from that. And another thing the Fraser Institute does is to track the economic performance of those countries that allow a great deal of economic freedom, founded very primarily on respect to property rights and in other spheres too. And you find that GDP per capita is much higher in all these countries. The poorest 10% do much better than they do in the least free countries. There has unfortunately been a kind of propaganda message that has gone out over decades to cast down the value of property rights, to indicate that this is just the rich being selfish. But it's not. It's everybody in the society, from the poor up, benefiting, and everybody having the freedom that property rights allows. Because if the state becomes the owner or the controller of not just every important asset in the country, this gives the state overweening power, which you cannot trust it to use well. So if you believe in a small state that does a limited number of functions well and efficiently, then you must allow property rights as the foundation for the private sector and individuals to prosper elsewhere.
Well said. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for, last comment. Would be very interesting to look at Namibia as well. There are various projects on the go there, and the permitting environment interactions with government department is apparently constructive. Saying that, Namibia often follows what happens in South Africa, so there is also a risk of BE creep there. Hopefully the good guys win, which I can only say, amen.
Yes, indeed. And they did draw back from a big BEE focus about 2016, 2017.
And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for having attended. Those of you who would like to engage with us further, please go to our website ir.org.za or our news site dailyfriend.org.za. All of this material is uploaded, and a recording of this webinar will be made available. With that, thank you very much for attending, and we wish you a wonderful day. For those of you in South Africa, probably a wonderfully chilly day. For those for those abroad, I see someone joining us from Stuttgart saying it's a hot day, and I understand it's 95 degrees in Florida right now. So, enjoy your day. Spread the message, and do keep in touch. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for being here.